Hey guys, what's going on? Welcome to another episode of Comic Book Workshop. Today I am looking at the comic artist Shawn Crystal. As usual, every week I do these little tutorials where I basically look at the art of comic artists and I break down things it is that we can learn from them and take and adopt into our own work. And so yeah, this should be fun. This guy's work is a lot of fun. I really enjoy looking at his work. I didn't really know of him until maybe half an hour ago, actually. But I enjoy his how playful his art is, and I think that's kind of a stylistic choice that I really appreciate. Like I love the guys who are like Jim Lee and Greg Capullo and these types of guys that are super detailed with their work. But I really appreciate people that have a kind of like spontaneity to their work as well. I think it lends itself very well to comics, and I think it's a lot of fun to look at. And so right now, what I'm doing is I'm drawing out some of the perspective lines because I want to see what I can understand about his perspective, right? So he has a number of different things going on with this drawing, and I have some sequentials of his, so we'll get to those in a minute, but I want to cover this first. But one of the things it is that you notice, especially with good perspective drawing, is that all of these lines that are going on the building, they're all diagonal, and they're cutting diagonally through the form of the figure here, right? And this draws an element of visual interest. Uh, the diagonal aspect to this, to these different lines it is that I'm drawing, it adds an element of visual interest. If you think if all of these lines were perfectly straight, then it wouldn't be that interesting. Now, there's a lot of people that kind of play around with that aspect of perspective. What I like about this drawing is these kind of abstract shapes that he plays around with, and these abstract patternings it is that he uses for his buildings, right? Like he's got these contrasting elements going on here. And if you just look at something like this shape here he puts on the building is pretty cool. And it actually reminds me more of, you know, um, the shape of a gun or something, right? Like this could be the barrel, and this is like the exit point right here, right? Like that could almost be like a gun. And so I think that if you're having a problem with perspective, one of the things that is that you can do is you can just build these very basic geometric forms like this, and these will really help you improve your ability to do stuff in perspective. Now, when we look at the figure himself, we see that the angle is actually swung the other way, right? So it's like this. All these lines in the background are like this, right? So this is completely intentional, obviously, and it's a good way to draw your attention to this point of contrast. This is something that I've talked a lot about on these tutorial videos, is that you always have elements of contrast in your drawing, right? And so with this gesture here, this provides that element of contrast. And with that element of contrast, your eye immediately goes to that point, right? It sticks out like a sore thumb, so to speak, right? And so we could look at a number of different ways in which it is that he uses elements of contrast in order to pull your eye here. One is these white shapes on the bat wings and on the cowl on the front. These contrast against the background, which obviously doesn't have a lot of white shapes on it, right? So that's one element, and then obviously the actual human figure obviously is always going to draw our attention to it, and the angle as well, right? So I've got some sequentials and stuff, and we'll get to those now. Um, yeah, I mean, well, I'll take a look at this one real quick too. So the other thing it is that I notice about these guys is that they're really smart about the way it is that they organize everything. And I think this just comes from, doing a lot of comic books, putting out a lot of books. I'm not sure what all Sean has worked on. Obviously, he's worked on some DC stuff. But you know, there's a symmetry to this. If I just break this down in terms of lines like that, and I take this away, if you just look at it just from this perspective, like this could have been the first initial sketch that he did within a minute of the drawing, you can see that there is a structure here. And there's different elements, right? So he had in mind that he wanted to group everything on this side, and he's adding this contrasting line element of this straight line that is contrasting against the curvature of Batman's body, right? Because obviously our where we want the person to look is here, right? So if I turn this layer back on and we look at it, we can see that we have the same sort of thing, which is that we have these interesting same sort of thing I've talked about before. We have these interesting groupings of uh, these black tones that point our eye in a specific direction. And we have almost the opposite of what we had before, which is that we have these black tones with with these white spaces. Well, or actually, it's very similar to the one. I should say it's very similar to the one we did before, where these white spaces in these black shapes really help create a level of visual interest in the drawing. And then obviously he's got this element of balance over here with the bat signal. So yeah, let's start looking at some sequential stuff. So I really enjoy his drawing style because it is deceptively simple and very expressive, right? So there's all sorts of different ways in which it is that he's using his understanding of composition. Oops, let me pull my canvas back up here. He's using elements of composition to direct the eye, right? And so this goes back to what I was talking about before, and it really shows how much he understands composition. We have the visual interest is here, is this story between these two women. And so you have a number of different visual elements that is creating a visual interest here. One, we have this window back here, which is creating this kind of ray effect. And this ray effect is pointing us all towards her and her. And notice that it's framed within this right here, right? And that he doesn't continue it here, right? Because he wants your eyes right here. And everything else is supporting your eye looking here. This railing right here is doing this. The angle of these mice or these rats, they're all, and this shape right here is keeping your eye from going this way. And so is this line right here. But notice it's not on this side, right? So there's different ways it is that you can think about the environment that the characters are sitting in and use those as basically ways to guide the viewer's eye to where it is that you want them to look, right? Because you could think of this as there's a million different ways it is that you could draw this scene. But what is it that is actually visually interesting and visually impactful? I think that this is very impactful, even though like I said, I just discovered this guy's work, so I'm not really familiar with the stories here, but there's a sense of radiance coming from this character because of because of these lines going away, right? There's like a sense of some sort of resolution or something. Obviously, from the expressions on the face, like maybe these are two characters that had been arguing before, and now they're coming and embracing one another. but it's also because of this shape right here, right? And so these these comic artists, they put a lot of thought and a lot of attention into the composition. So, to an average viewer, to the to a beginning level comic artist, you might hear me when I say, "Oh, well, there's like this kind of radiance around her," and you might think that, well, he probably wasn't thinking about that. It just kind of came out that way. Maybe, but I think that there's more thought put into the composition than most beginners realize. And this is another example of that. A beginner just looks at something like this and they go, okay, well, it is an interesting looking drawing, but there's a compositional element to this that I think is really smart. And that is that we follow her descent into being unconscious in this kind of rotational way, in a way that's really interesting because, like I've mentioned before, the task of a comic artist is that you have to be able to tell a story. Each page has to tell a story, and it also has to be a beautiful drawing, right? And sometimes it's easier to do one or the other. That's why a lot of people do pinups and not a lot of people do sequentials, because telling a story and then also making it look presentable as if you could take this drawing here and sell it is it's a challenge, right? So if we think about it from that perspective, it's interesting to see the creative decisions that he's making, because everything is, again, it's all kind of has this kind of radial setup, doesn't it? And notice that all of the points of interest that you would have fall on this kind of radial composition that's going on here, right? So I love the way that he does this. We got this first panel where we see she's getting dizzy, and then we see something is happening. Maybe this is her. Okay, this is her friend here. So we're seeing from her perspective what she is seeing. So he's keeping the position of the characters in the right position, and we just see that her vision is getting dizzy. She's getting double vision, and then we see that she seems to be her eyes are closing, but also look at the way that the panel is drawn. The panel is drawn as if it's tipping over, whereas this one is perfectly upright. And then we break into a full illustration, and we see the background here, and we see that the point of interest basically almost has another panel drawn around it in a sense, with this black shadow that is surrounding her laying here. And she's in a black shirt with black hair, and she's laying on a completely white background, right? And then notice that even the bartender himself, and this visual storytelling element here of the broken glass, uh, they're all within that same space, right? And then we continue to fall into darkness. And what happens to the panels? The panels they begin to get smaller and smaller until they find like a resting place. And this is perfectly symmetrical. But these still feel like they're falling, and then she's hit a resting place. She's unconscious. Really smart. Yeah, I mean, this one I might not have as much to say about it, but stuff like this is kind of the vibe it is that I'm going for personally in my own work. Is it's fun. For one thing, it's fun. Um, he has strong gestures, and a strong understanding of black and white. He's not afraid to break these rules of shadow by putting these objects on the wall that are completely in white, uh, in order to create a sense of visual interest and a sense of depth, right? Because if you think that, like, if this, oops, if this was completely, um, if this was completely in black, let's see what would it look like. It still works, you know. It still works, but there's a visual interest that I think that a decision like that brings into the piece. And notice also that this character is not really cast in a shadow, but is hidden in shadow, right? And then you've got these players, or you've got these characters uh, facing off against one another, and you have this great reaction shot. And then we see why it is that he created that visual interest there. Was that, is this the same thing right here? So I'm curious how she got to this, if that's the case. Maybe there's another one sitting on the desk. Maybe on a previous page we were introduced to it. He definitely thought it through. So we've got a couple more here we'll go ahead and go over. Yeah, so there's just very simple compositional choices that help him organize things in a way that makes it very visually appealing, right? I mean, when you look at a page like this, I don't think I have as much to say about this page. But again, it goes back to that same rule of what I was talking about before, which is that the comic page, it has to tell the story, but then it also has to be of visual interest, right? This is some stuff he did for Deadpool. Yeah, really cool stuff. All right, I think I'm going to go ahead and close it out at that. I love how abstract he can get with his work. It kind of reminds me of Templesmith, Ben Templesmith, a little bit. I'm going to have to do a video on him at some point too. Anyway, I am going to include a link in the description box to this guy's work, any kind of social media stuff or whatever I can find on him. I'll include it in the links in the description box. Other than that, I hope that these videos are of use to you guys. If there's a comic artist that is you'd like for me to look at and break down his stuff, feel free to drop a comment in the comment box down below. If you'd like to support what I do on my channel, I've got a Patreon. For $5, you get my comics and some exclusive or early tutorials. And so I'm going to be putting some stuff there. And I should have more updates on what I'm working on coming out soon as well. So anyways, guys, thank you so much for watching and take care.